Mary Stuart, better known as Mary, Queen of Scots, lived the kind of tumultuous life that biographers only dream about. Mary was just days old when she was named the monarch of an entire country, and she packed an extraordinary amount of conflict, scheming, and betrayal into her 44 years on Earth. So, today we're running through everything that had to happen for Mary, Queen of Scots, to be executed in front of 500 people. But before we get started, make sure you've subscribed to the Weird History channel. After that, jump down to the comments and let us know what other controversial figures you want to hear about. Okay, it's time to find out why there's something about Mary. Mary Stuart was born in December 1542 and was the only surviving legitimate child of King James V of Scotland. He had a number of illegitimate children, too, as kings often did back then. More on them later. When Mary was just 6 days old, her father James died, possibly from stress following the Scottish defeat by the English at the recent Battle of Solway Moss, or possibly from an infection he received from drinking contaminated water. Either way, the infant Mary was named Queen of Scotland as his successor. It was a lot to put on a baby, but before she had staked out any policy positions, honestly, before she could say her first word, Mary's reign was already controversial due to the religious split between Catholicism and Protestantism driving a wedge through the center of Europe. James V's uncle was Henry VIII, the Tudor monarch and weird history all-star who famously broke with the Catholic Church in the 1530s and declared himself as the head of the Church of England. James opted not to follow suit, but used the situation as leverage to gain favors from the Pope and other Catholic rulers across Europe. When James died, Cardinal David Beaton made a play for the Regency of Scotland, which would have kept them solidly on Team Catholic. But the position ultimately fell to the Protestant James Hamilton, 2nd Earl of Arran. When the Treaty of Greenwich between Scotland and England was signed in 1543, it established that, when she reached age 10, Mary would wed Henry VIII's son and heir, Edward, thus forging a permanent union between the two nations. Again, seems like we're really hanging a lot on this baby. But Scotland's Parliament rejected the treaty, leading to a military campaign known as the Rough Wooing, in which Henry attempted to force the country to accept the union between Mary and Edward. After the murder of Cardinal Beaton and heavy Scottish losses at the Battle of Pinkie in 1547, Mary's guardians and regents turned to King Henry II of France for assistance. He agreed to eventually marry his son, the Dauphin Francis, to Mary when they both reached adulthood. And Scotland's Parliament approved this union in 1548. Mary was still just 5 years old. Meanwhile, in England, Henry VIII died in 1547 at age 55. He was succeeded by his son, Edward VI, but at age 15, he contracted a mysterious disease, and then he passed away in 1553. Following a brief succession crisis, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, the Catholic Mary I, was crowned in October of that year. This means we now have multiple King Henrys and 2 Queen Marys. So just remember, we're mainly talking about the other one, Mary Stuart from Scotland. And Henry II is from France, while Henry VIII was from England. Did we clear all that up? Great, let's move on. In France, Mary Stuart lived at the court of Henry II from age 5 through 18. She was accompanied by 2 of her illegitimate half-brothers, a group of daughters of prominent Scottish nobles who were around her age, and her father's half-sister, Lady Fleming, who was appointed as her governess. As a young adult, Mary also spent a lot of time with her maternal grandmother, Antoinette de Bourbon, known to her friends as Tony Whiskey, who became a key advisor. Mary received a thorough education in France and was a favorite of many of the adults at court, though she was hated by Henry II's wife, the infamous Catherine de' Medici. In fairness, it's not clear whether Catherine de' Medici liked anyone. In 1558, after signing a secret agreement promising to bequeath her claim on Scotland and England to the French if her marriage failed to produce an heir, Mary and Francis were married at Notre Dame Cathedral. Meanwhile, Mary I, now known as Bloody Mary due to her aggressive persecution of Protestants and attempts to end the English Reformation, perished in November 1558, although she's been known to reappear from time to time if you say her name into a mirror. As Henry VIII's last will and testament excluded any Stuart monarch from ever ascending to the English throne, Bloody Mary was succeeded by her younger half-sister, the Protestant Elizabeth I. Many Catholics felt this decision was illegitimate, and that Mary Stuart, the eldest surviving descendant of Henry's father, Henry VII, and Margaret Tudor, was the true queen. Henry II of France agreed, and declared his eldest son Francis and daughter-in-law Mary the true English monarchs. When Henry II died the following year from jousting-related injuries, which was a real thing people used to have to deal with before American gladiators elevated the sport, Francis and Mary were crowned as King and Queen of France, even though they were both still teenagers. This made two of Mary's uncles and close advisors, the Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine, suddenly very powerful and influential in French politics. It appeared, at least briefly, that a newly unified Franco-Scottish alliance could reintroduce Catholicism across the British Isles. Meanwhile, a Franco-American alliance could introduce SpaghettiOs. But this period would turn out to be short-lived. The French court was temporarily distracted by a Protestant uprising known as the Tumult of Amboise. Then Mary's husband, King Francis II of France, died in December 1560 after an ear infection spiraled out of control, which is a much less cool way to die than joust-related injuries. Mary returned to Scotland in August 1561, but she was unfamiliar with the country, its people, and its politics, having spent nearly her entire life in France. Plus, she was a well-known Catholic taking over a country with a strong Protestant faction, including the devoutly Protestant Queen of England, with whom she'd been locked in a years-long power struggle from afar. To the surprise of many, rather than aggressively pushing Catholicism on her subjects, Mary was more relaxed about the whole thing. She maintained her predecessor's panel of advisors, known as the Privy Council, rather than replacing them with her own confidants. Mary even kept the Protestant Earl of Moray, one of her illegitimate half-brothers, on hand as a chief advisor. These moves helped endear Mary to her subjects, at least a bit. A number of possible matches were considered for Mary's next husband, but ultimately, Mary selected her English half-cousin Henry Stuart, better known as Lord Darnley, whom she had met while still in mourning for Francis. The marriage proved unpopular with many, including Elizabeth, who feared that their children would have an even stronger claim to the throne. Scottish Protestants also disliked the match, as both Mary and Darnley were Catholics. Some openly rebelled against the crown in a series of small uprisings known as the Chaseabout Raid. Riots had such fun names back then. Soon enough, the marriage between Mary and Darnley grew strained, as he sought greater political power, and she took an increasingly intense interest in her private secretary, David Rizzio, who was somehow neither a Muppet nor a character from Greece. Darnley was slain in February 1567 in an explosion at the home of Sir James Balfour, a former abbey known whimsically as Kirklefield. Mary was suspected of being involved in Darnley's death, alongside James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell. Those suspicions increased a few months later when Mary and Lord Bothwell were married, in what was rumored to be a Protestant ceremony. Also, he had "Blow Up Lord Darnley" written in his day planner, which was difficult to explain. Mary had believed that the Scottish nobility would accept the union and rally around her, but she soon discovered this pairing was even more controversial than her last. Many prominent Scots were upset that Mary would so quickly marry a man who had been potentially implicated in her husband's death, which had been suspicious even by the most generous definition of the word. Catholics were incensed that Bothwell had only divorced his previous wife 12 days before his marriage to Mary, and were further angered by the rumors about Protestant wedding rites. In all, 26 Scottish peers announced plans to raise an army against the couple. In June, at Carberry Hill, Mary turned herself over to an assembled group of Scottish lords in exchange for Bothwell's safe passage out of the country. He was exiled to Denmark. He died in 1578 without ever laying eyes on Mary again. Harsh. Back at home, Mary was forced to abdicate her throne in favor of her 1-year-old son, James VI. Why do we keep putting babies in charge? While her former advisor, the Earl of Moray, was made regent. Mary was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle until May 1568, when she escaped and raised an army of around 6,000, hoping to retake the throne. But her small force wasn't up to the task, and it only took Scottish Protestants around an hour to turn her army right back around. She'd hoped to receive some material support from her cousin Elizabeth for her cause, but the English monarch was too cautious and expressed concern about the ongoing rumors implicating Mary in Darnley's explosive demise. Though Mary was permitted to remain in England, her relationship with Elizabeth had been permanently severed, particularly after the Earl of Moray formally named Mary as an accomplice in Lord Darnley's big kaboom. In January 1569, Mary was moved to Tutbury Castle under the watchful custody of the Earl of Shrewsbury, and she was no longer permitted to leave his property. It was a luxurious royal version of house arrest. Over the next 19 years, Mary was implicated in a number of plots and conspiracies to steal Elizabeth's throne. These included the Ridolfi Plot of 1571, in which King Philip II of Spain, the Pope and Spain's ambassador to England, collaborated to remove Elizabeth and appoint Mary as queen. The conspiracy was named for Florentine banker Roberto Ridolfi, who was discovered with messages implicating the Duke of Norfolk in the scheme. In response to this and other conspiracies, Elizabeth's Privy Council passed two laws in 1584 and 1585 that paved the way for Mary's eventual downfall. In the Bond of Association, members of the Privy Council vowed to dispatch not only anyone who attempted to assassinate Queen Elizabeth, but any claimant to the throne in whose direct interests the attempt had been made. The Act for the Queen's Safety, passed the following year, ordered not just trial and execution, but exclusion from succession for anyone involved in a plot against the Queen. In 1586, English authorities intercepted a letter bound for Mary, written by Catholic English aristocrat Anthony Babington. Writing in code, Babington told Mary he had a group of 6 gentlemen ready to assassinate Elizabeth, pending Mary's approval. Mary allegedly wrote back to Babington on July 16th asking to meet these gentlemen. This was all the Privy Council needed to see in order to finally remove Mary from the board. Babington and his associates were tried and executed in September, while Mary herself was put on trial at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire in October. She not only disputed the truth of the charges, but further argued that, as she did not recognize Elizabeth's claim to the throne, she was not subject to English law, otherwise known as the Braveheart defense. Nonetheless, Mary was found guilty of treason and was beheaded on February 8, 1587, before a crowd of hundreds of onlookers. No word on whether they sold t-shirts. So what do you think? Was Mary, Queen of Scots, a backstabbing villain, or just unlucky? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.